Hello and welcome, Bryn Bliska. Thank you so much for being here with us. We can't wait to talk to you and find out a little bit more about what you do. So Bryn Bliska is a musician, composer, and producer all around. She's based in Brooklyn, New York. And I think I'm going to leave it to her, though, to explain a little bit more about, that's actually the first thing I wanted to ask you. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you got started in the industry and then what it is that you do now? What is your role, maybe?
Yeah, definitely. So I have sort of an interesting story. I feel like as many people who end up in the music business, I, fell in love with music at an early age. I apparently begged my parents to start playing the piano when I was around 2, and they gratefully obliged and were able to support me in that endeavor. So I played music from a really young age and really just sort of studied kind of a mix of classical and jazz piano and music theory and songwriting. I was lucky to have a really creative teacher who had a very out of the box approach and a very holistic approach to sort of just becoming a musician. So basically grew up studying piano, kind of always identified as a player, wrote songs when I was in middle school and a little bit before, played in various school bands, got an early Mbox, which was one of the early Pro Tools rigs, and recorded demos and made little CDs and stuff. And then in high school, I kind of continued the same path. I got really into jazz, thanks to another really amazing piano teacher. So I sort of started playing more jazz, composing more jazz, singing a bit more, still sort of identifying primarily as a musician and a composer. Then it sort of came time for me to go to college potentially, and I decided I didn't want to go to music school. So I kind of kept a more broad education, and actually my undergrad was in neuroscience. So I studied a bunch of music, studied a bunch of science, left college, started in this kind of music technology research group at MIT because I was like, maybe I'll be an academic.
Is that New Wave?
No, that's actually different. Yeah. So that was this thing called the MIT Media Lab, which is a really amazing sort of interdisciplinary research center. And got to work on a bunch of really cool projects, and ultimately sort of left feeling like I really just wanted to pursue a more traditional, or not traditional, but a more straightforward, me as a creator of music career. Because I was like, if I'm not satisfied in as untraditional of an environment as academia, I don't think anything short of just kind of working as a musician in some form is going to make me happy. So yeah, I basically left that, kind of spent some time living at home, and then moved to New York because I had figured out that's where I wanted to be. And yeah, kind of just launched into it. So I would say the main thing that sort of developed for me over college was I really fell in love with being in the studio and producing music, as opposed to just performing, which is really what I had done mostly my whole life. So kind of moving to New York, I knew that I wanted to get more into production, but I had not a lot of experience outside of producing my own music. So really for the first couple of years of living here, I was sort of a hermit. And despite the fact that I moved here because I had a lot of friends in a big creative community, I really didn't play any shows. I was kind of on the grind. One, just trying to survive, and two, honing my skills as a producer, because I knew that I sort of needed to put in that time in order to level up if I was gonna, get any gigs that I wanted to get, etc. Yeah, so as I sort of started honing my skills, I started taking on some freelance composing work as well. So some of it's commercially oriented, some of it's more for podcasts or other sort of multimedia projects. And then kind of slowly but surely, I was like, okay, I'm ready to play shows again, started gigging with people. And then that was really how I met a lot of artists who I now produce music for or do remixes for, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, now I would say I sort of do a kind of an even split of composing work, me playing keys, either live or session work, and then producing work. And then I actually guess there's a fourth third, which is sample work, which is what New Wave is. So yeah, sort of those 4 things are kind of where I am currently at, independent production, composing, session work, and sample making. Cool. Awesome. Yeah, that was a long explanation.
I I wanted to ask you a little bit more about maybe how technology plays a role in what you do. So you moved from studying jazz and classical piano into technology, and maybe some of your education had an influence on that. I'm not sure, with neuroscience and what you did at the programs there. But how does technology really merge with jazz and your R&B influences? And do you find there's a careful balance that has to be struck between like staying true to the music and like adding a modern twist?
Yeah, totally. So I feel like the bridge for me is that I think I'm sort of addicted to like learning new things. So I think for a long part of my life, I was just so interested in music theory and sort of, especially as a piano player, I would say harmony, because the piano is such a great harmonic instrument. And then kind of in college, as I got a bit of access to being in like a nice recording studio and using software that had a bit more creative potential, I would think sort of the door just opened and I was like, oh wow, like here is just this whole other dimension of like creative potential that I want to explore. And I've always sort of been like a math and science person anyways. So I think as soon as I kind of realized those worlds could connect, I was like, this is great. I'm so excited. But yeah, I think for me, just using music technology as a means to explore creativity. And I think with all music, we're in such an awesome field because it's constantly just growing and changing all these ways. And I think technology is one of those ways where it continues to change really interestingly. Like most new music that I hear, there's some people that I think have just like incredibly classic songwriting, they're just amazing musicians. But I would say most of what I hear nowadays, if something catches me, it's probably like a production thing that's innovative, because I feel like that's where a lot of people are innovating right now. So for me, I think the technology piece is just like an extension of the creativity. But yeah, I think me coming from that traditional music background, like I think I don't take it for granted per se, but it is like a huge foundation upon which everything else rests. So I wouldn't say any of my music would sound the same, if I didn't have that.
It's a really interesting balance that you have of these two worlds, and I think it's fascinating. Can you tell us a little bit about your work with the Opera of the Future group and what you've been doing and what the intent is there?
Yeah, so the Opera of the Future group, that's the name of that sort of division within MIT that I was sort of studying and working for. So it's a group run by this awesome composer named Todd Mackover, and he has a really deep history in sort of technology, invention, like creative composition. So for the year that I spent with them, it was kind of a mix of things. One project that I worked on a lot, which was really cool, was part of a series of projects that he's done, which are called City Symphonies. And the whole idea is that, the group pairs up with a particular city. And in this year it was Detroit. So we worked with, the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, and basically tried to literally crowdsource, like via mobile recording, sounds from the city. And then also I was sort of a liaison on that project. So about once every 3 to 4 weeks, I went to Detroit and essentially networked with people there, like met different musicians and creatives, and found ways to get them like literally as performers in this, what was ultimately a symphony, or to record them and then have that sort of composed into the symphony by Todd. So that was a really fun, massively collaborative project that I was on there. Another thing I did there, which was kind of unrelated, but also really cool. I paired up with a really awesome guy named Charles Holbrow, who is really an incredible like computer programmer, I would say, like just an amazing technology guy. And we had this idea to essentially create some sort of device that could generate tempo maps that change. So, I really like polyrhythm in music. And the idea was, could you take what's one sort of polyrhythm and then have it algorithmically change over time to become another polyrhythm? So it sounds really insane.
Wow.
There's an example on my website of like what it sounds like. And it's basically like you can hear something super syncopated and then it kind of goes out of phase. And then eventually it kind of like locks back into a new phase. So that was just like a weird, nerdy experiment that we did. There's a lot of fun things like that. But yeah, for me, that was just like a really cool year of exploration. And ultimately it left me just feeling really inspired to kind of dive into the music industry in a more like full-time an immediate way. So
And from a very
that's
unique perspective too. That's very, very cool.
Yeah, definitely.
Can you, one of the things that you do, I guess, I should have realized this when I was asking you about New Wave before, but that is mostly involved with sample creation and collaboration. Can you maybe tell some of our viewers, talk about the application of samples and who uses them and why?
Yeah, definitely. So sample making is something that I kind of came into pretty, I would say, unexpectedly and unintentionally. Although, you know, I'm a huge like lover of hip hop. So like listening to sample-based music and sometimes creating it is something that's like very much been a part of my musical upbringing, I guess I would say. But yeah, so I think for a combination of reasons, you know, gratefully, most music technology and sort of music making tools are becoming more and more affordable. So more and more people are producing music on their own, which is amazing. And so samples are sort of this way that someone who may not either play an instrument or may not even like record audio on their own can immediately sort of start composing music from audio, right? So it's in combination potentially with MIDI and virtual instruments, that sort of thing. But I think the world of samples is really blowing up in this huge way because so many people are making music and so many people are making music in a really digital manner. So I think as someone with a strong instrumental background and like more of an engineering background, like recording engineering, I sort of fell into this world of, you know, I can essentially be a session musician but kind of present that product in these like little micro pieces that, you know, a ton of people can use in their production. So I was fortunate enough to be a part of this program that Splice, which is, you know, one of the sort of predominant sample companies, I guess I would say, ran in 2019. It was called the Creator Class. And essentially it was like 12 or so people who all, you know, we had music backgrounds, music production backgrounds. We're not necessarily sound designers or sample makers, but people who were interested in getting into that world. So they really taught us sort of how Splice works, particularly as a business model, you know, what kinds of products they sell, how to like create products for them. And then after that experience, about half of us were like, okay, you know, we made a bunch of content together. And then some of us were like, okay, let's keep doing this. Like we love making samples. So we decided to found this sample label, New Wave. So it's an independent label, mean that we're sort of like co-owned and co-run as a collaborative, but we distribute through Splice, so they sort of host our content as well.
Oh, I see.
But yeah, I think sample making is definitely, you know, I think it's only going to continue to grow. You see huge records that use samples from Splice, which is kind of nuts. And as a producer, there's like a large contingency of people who also will pitch samples directly to other producers, so not selling them necessarily for public use, for royalty free use, but pitching them, you know, as like a loop to be like, do you want to make a record with this? Especially in the pandemic era when we're not often in the studio together. Right. I think it's sort of distributed creation that way, yeah.
And I like the point that you mentioned about the fact that people who utilize samples aren't necessarily musicians or artists in their own right. But totally. If there's, maybe you could share with our listeners who aren't necessarily musically inclined as on an instrument or in composition, how would one get started putting together, utilizing sample music if they don't have any background with instruments themselves?
Yeah, totally. So I think that's one of the awesome things about, you know, a platform like Splice is you can really just follow your ear. And one of the sort of like technical things that they do that makes samples easy to work with is, you know, every sample that's in a tempo is labeled with that tempo as well as a key. So, you know, you can sort of let your ear guide you, but those sort of like really basic descriptors of tempo and key can help you maybe decide, like, do these two samples possibly work together? Like maybe you find a bass loop that you love and, you know, a keyboard loop you could check out and see that they're in the same key and then potentially put those together in a track in some way. And that's definitely not to say that you can't take things that are in one key and either change the key, or you could superimpose things that are labeled in different keys, but they might actually work together. So I'm definitely all about breaking the rules. But if you're just trying to look for, you know, an easy way to kind of start with things that might work together, finding things that are either in the right key the same key that is, or transposing them so that they are in the same key, and then sort of locking them to your tempo grid in some way. Even if you did that like completely randomly without listening to the samples first, you would probably come up with something really interesting that you could then modify. So yeah, I think the sample world is awesome because it sort of gives you instant inspiration, and then you can kind of take it wherever you want from there.
And what program or programs would you recommend for people to get into start to get into that?
So, I mean, I'm not really a snob when it comes to any sort of software. I personally use Ableton Live for production, which is not actually what I learned on, because in college we were really trained to use Pro Tools and Logic, but kind of word of mouth of some friends of mine, everyone was like, Ableton is really awesome, particularly for like merging studio and live applications. And so kind of towards the end of college, I was like, oh, I definitely want to get into this, and checked it out. And I was like, oh yes, this is awesome. So for me, Ableton works really well as a DAW. But even something like GarageBand is incredibly capable right now. You know, it's amazing how far all these softwares have come. But yeah, GarageBand is great. A lot of friends use Logic. A lot of like heavy audio people still use Pro Tools. Reason is actually a really cool tool that I got into sort of last year, because it's now not only a standalone sort of music production application, but it's also now you can use it within a different DAW, which is a digital audio workstation. So yeah, I think really anything that you can get your hands on is great. And it's just about learning. They all pretty much do the same thing with minor quirks. Yeah.
Right. Good answer. Right. Good.
That's awesome. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about like getting proficient in an instrument. What would you say was key to your success when you were learning the piano or learning the keyboard? And is there some like things that you did in specific that you would recommend to other artists? Maybe you could also talk a little bit about your current practice regime.
Yeah, totally. So there's so much to say on that. I think the most important thing when you're learning any instrument is really to follow like what it is that you want to be able to do on the instrument, right? So I think as a jazz musician, sometimes I think often we spend a lot of time transcribing, or like when I was earlier in my studies, like transcribing other people's playing that you just really like, to sort of get that into your brain, and then eventually you sort of combine enough things that it starts to like become your own sound. So I think really like identifying which aspects of the instrument you want to sort of become the most capable on, focusing on those. And then really I would say like the main practice advice I have is just consistency. I had a teacher in college who, you know, his whole thing was like play like 6 days a week, and even if for one of those days you're only playing for 10 minutes, like don't skip that day. And I definitely am a believer in like consistent practice. I would say obviously during sort of my peak practice years, I was practicing for like many, many hours a day, which I unfortunately just don't have time for anymore, because I'm too busy like trying to finish projects and like make things that will actually exist in the world rather than just me shedding. But yeah, in terms of my current practice routine, so I do have sort of like a couple different technical, I guess I would say like regimens that I go through almost every day, just to sort of keep my like physical facility at sort of like training athletically. And then there's kind of like a rotating cast of things that I'm interested in studying a little bit more of. So I'll just do a little bit of exploring into one of those topics. And then often I'm kind of working on some sort of transcription like in the background, just like very slowly. So those are like regular parts of my routine. So I've played guitar for a while, like very intuitively, and I never really studied, but sort of towards the beginning of last year, like right actually before like lockdown hit in New York, I bought an electric guitar. So that's been a fun exercise for me because, you know, I'm never going to be as good at guitar as I am at piano, and I don't really want to be, but like for me, it was about identifying, okay, the main things I want to be able to do are like play guitar in songs that I produce. So that's like getting a lot of chord voicings under my belt, getting like sounds under my belt, so it like sounds like a good guitar, even if I can't play like ripping. And then just kind of like identifying like the basic melodic things that I wanted to be able to do on my own. So that's been a fun exercise of like me having to like try to put some of my musical knowledge on an instrument where I have like very little technical facility, but kind of like working on it in a more targeted way.
Yeah, and I'm curious also, when you're transcribing as a jazz musician, is that something you do personally by ear, or is it something that you really focus on sheet music and writing things out?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, the transcribing process, I think, is necessarily like done by ear. And then like whether you decide to write that out for your own sort of like future reference, that kind of goes back and forth. Like there have definitely been times where I wanted to transcribe something and like have a written record of it. Or I was like assigned to do that for a class, so I needed to produce such a work. I would say a lot of the time with transcription, for me, it's a process of like literally listening and often slowing down the music so you can hear everything. And then just like actually learning to play it like immediately from that. And I never write it down. I've never been like the most, like I can read music, but I'm not like one of those people who's an incredible sight reader. And for me, like learning music by ear has always been my main mode, or like chord charts and like the real book kind of type deal. So for me, like the writing down stage is more something that I either feel like I have to do, or like I'm writing out music for other people. But if there's not that need, like I'm never gonna do it otherwise, because it's just like not my thing.
I get that. You've done some scoring work for video and podcast for companies like New York Times and NPR. What does that sort of work look like as a musician? Where do you start? How do you get into that field? And what do you have to deliver?
Yeah, totally. So scoring is a really fun kind of area of composing, I think. And I've noticed that there's like a big difference for me in terms of like what scoring for podcasts looks like and what scoring to picture looks like. So in my experience, most of the podcast oriented scoring I've done has been sort of creating more like a suite of music that's then ultimately like edited in by someone who's mixing the episode. So usually it's like, okay, there's going to be this X number of episodes, and I'll have a conversation with the producers about like what sort of emotional tones, like what sort of literal like genre and sonic references are we going to evoke. And then often what I'm delivering is like kind of a collection of tracks, like an EP or like a record almost, as well as probably like stems and different cut downs of those tracks, so that they can then sort of like use that to score as many episodes as they end up needing to do, et cetera, et cetera. So I think for the podcast, it's really about like setting the tone and providing, what can underscore content of different natures and sort of like the arcs of these stories as they're being told. And it's a little more flexible than scoring to picture, where you're like literally locking it into something that's already made. So you are kind of in real time telling that story along with the visual media and the voiceover. So in terms of getting into that world, I think because I've always written music, I knew that it would be a really great outlet for that. And I think as a producer, making sort of music for release to streaming services, like there's kind of a range of things that you could probably like claim as like a commercial product. And I think scoring is great because it really encompasses like so much more. Not to say that like you can really release any kind of music you want. But I think for most of the production gigs that I get, it's a little more like straightforward. And a lot of the scoring gigs are like more experimental and weird, which I really appreciate. But for me, getting those gigs has been like pretty largely like word of mouth. And then sort of like once you start just getting more sort of via your network. But I think for someone who's interested in starting out scoring, the most important thing to do is like create what's called a reel. So this is basically, you can take whatever video content you have available to you. Maybe you like find a student filmmaker, or you straight up like pull an ad from YouTube and take the music out, and then basically create your own scores so that you could send to someone and be like, hey, like this is something I'm interested in. Here's some sample work. Even if it hasn't been released, you can just show them like what sort of things you're interested in doing. So that's a great way to sort of just jump in if you're like,
right. A great advice to even practice getting into that. I
Exactly.
never thought of doing something like that, taking the audio out and doing your own.
Yeah, totally.
Smart.
Wow.
Very cool.
Yeah, Jory and I Also wanted to ask you, so we started this new segment on the podcast called Desert Island Album List. So we wanted to ask you, if you were trapped on a desert island, what would be your maybe top 5 albums that you couldn't be without? Or
oh my gosh, these questions always stress me out so much because there's so much music I love. Okay, so I'll think of things that I've really been enjoying a lot recently. Okay, so kind of like all-time favorites. I'm like a huge D'Angelo fan. His record Black Messiah is like something I could never get sick of. So definitely that. I would say probably To Pimp a Butterfly by Kendrick Lamar. Oh, there's really, really so many. I'm a huge Brad Mehldau fan. He's a jazz pianist. So maybe like one of his trio albums. That's 3. I love SZA, so probably her record. I'm forgetting the name, but the one that's like her main LP. And then, I feel like I've covered a lot of good ground.
You have.
It's a tough like question. Phoebe Bridgers for when I'm like really depressed and just like want to feel sad. I love her so much. Her record from last year was awesome.
That's awesome. And yeah, and then the last thing we usually ask our guests to end off the sessions is what you gave a lot of awesome advice already, but if there could be one piece of advice or wisdom you'd like to impart on young musicians who are maybe just starting out, what would you say to them?
Yeah, totally. So I think my main advice is really to just be true to yourself. I think it's a confusing industry because you're constantly trying to sort of make it quote unquote, or like fit into something that's currently existing and evolving. But I found like my greatest successes have been when I really didn't overthink things and I just kind of went with my gut and like did what makes me unique and is like what I really feel most connected to. So I would say like, even if you feel like there's not currently a lane for you or you're unclear about where you're fit in, you know, just really try to stay true to yourself as you like explore and navigate.
That's good advice.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much, Bryn.
Yeah,
yeah, we really appreciate your time and your wisdom. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you guys both so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, all the best this year, and we'll hopefully see you again.
Thanks. You guys too.
Thanks.
Bye.